All right. Hello, everybody. So this is going to be our first note packet in the evolution unit. That's unit 8. We just finished up with the unit 7 test over how we look at traits, inheritable traits, how they move through generations. Now we're going to kind of talk about how populations change over time, and how that's related to inheritable traits. In this unit, we'll be discussing evolution, specifically natural selection, patterns of evolution, evidence of evolution, and phylogeny. So as we go through this, there'll be questions here in the play posit, but I also would like you to be filling out your note packet as we go through this. All right, so let's begin. So evolution, all evolution is change over time. That's all evolution means. And there's two types of evolution: micro, which micro means small, and macro, which means big. So when we talk about micro and macro evolution, um, micro evolution would say that there was an ancestral sheep. From that came different breeds of sheep. These types of sheep may still be able to interbreed, similar to like dogs and different breeds of dogs. Whereas macro, large scale evolution is going to say that there was a common ancestor, and from that common ancestor came all the variety of life we see today. We're going to focus on micro evolution in this note packet, but we'll talk about macro evolution at a later time. So right now, that should be number one there in your notes. Draw a picture showing the difference. Okay, on to talking about who came up with these ideas. Well, the very first person to talk about populations and organisms was Aristotle. So 350 BC, that's this dude over here. It's this guy. Um, he believed that species were fixed creations arranged by their complexity. So what's that mean? Well, earthworms are less complex than snakes, essentially. Um, this was this idea lasted for about 2,000 years, and didn't really change a whole lot until we got to this guy. This is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So Lamarck was going to be one of the first ones to be talking about change over time within populations, looking at biodiversity. Why do we see this variety of life we have today? Um, he was a little off the mark here. He was on the right track, but he said that changes to organisms are adaptations to an environment acquired in an organism's lifetime. So that's where he's going to be off the mark. He's also going to be off the mark when he says that these changes are passed to offspring. So, um, within a lifetime, let's talk about what that means. So, Lamarck would look at this giraffe and he would say that this is an adult giraffe here. And that same adult giraffe, after it's fully grown, could be driven by an inner need. That's what it shows down here, driven by an inner need to make its neck grow longer over time so that it could reach higher branches. And he would have said that because that giraffe's neck stretched, the offspring of this giraffe would also have longer necks. Okay, so we know that like once an adult is at their height they're going to be, that's their fixed height for life, right? If anything, they'll shrink a little bit as their spine compresses over time. But um, traits don't really change, especially like you can't change your genes because of an inner need for food or water or space, whatever that might be. All right, so Lamarck was a little bit off the mark. But what he did acknowledge is that the environment plays a role in shaping a species, and that evolution is a constant process. Um, but he said it's striving for perfection. But what does perfection really even mean? There's no really like perfect species. You might be well suited for your environment, but there's no like perfect species, right? So Darwin disagreed that it's a striving for perfection. And what he concluded is that evolution, instead of striving towards a goal, evolution is just random, just completely random based on which organisms are best suited for their environment and are best suited to reproduce. So let's talk about Darwin a little bit here. So if we remember at the beginning of the year, we talked about Darwin. He was an English naturalist. He went on a voyage to the Galapagos. Um, and this was in 1835, and he saw all these different bird species, these finches, all these different tortoises. If we remember, here's the Galapagos here, pretty much straight south of Michigan, and just off the coast of Ecuador over here. It's made up of all these different islands here, 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 and on all these different islands that he visited, he saw different species of tortoises and finches. He noticed that they all looked very similar, yet they were different species, and that was key for him. Based off of his observations, he came up with a mechanism of natural selection, and that's how evolution occurs, natural selection. All right, so let's take a look at the finches, for instance. And again, this should be reviewed from the beginning of the year. Um, and just if you're keeping up in your notes, you should be down to number 4 right now. You should just be through number 4. Um, so what he said about the finches. Finches on the island resembled the mainland finch. This was the mainland finch, and if you remember, let's go back a slide here. Right, mainland is over here. What he would have said is that there was a population of finches that came over from the mainland and then spread out to all those islands. And on all those different islands, there was different types of food available. Well, some birds from this original finch had different types, slightly different beaks, not drastically different, but just slightly different. And because of these slight differences, they were more successful at eating food on these different islands. Over time, the ones that were more successful reproduced, had offspring, and their offspring maybe even had better beaks. And over time, on each island, characteristics accumulated in the finches there so that what we see today is that, like on an island with fruit, we see kind of this shorter beak here. On an island where there's insects, we see the woodpecker finch, nice long beak here, and something that's eating seeds is going to have a crushing beak here, right? These guys have seeds that are crushing beaks. All right, so these are all different species of birds today, but they all genetically are related to that original species from which they diverged. Okay, and that's what this slide is summarizing here. Um, and we'll keep going here. So he wrote a book on the origin of species, kind of summarizing his findings. What do we need for this to happen, right? What do we need for natural selection to happen? So in natural selection, we say that some organisms survive because they're and reproduce because they're better suited to the environment. We might have heard of this being called survival of the fittest. Well, what does it mean to be fit? Being fit doesn't necessarily mean being the strongest or fastest. What it really means, fittest really means reproduction. Are you able to reproduce and pass down your genetic information? Okay. So it's based on these following principles. Number one, variation. If we're going to have survival of the fittest, okay, you have to have variation. You can't be the fittest if everybody is equally fit. There has to be variation. Number two is inheritance, and we just saw this in the last unit, that traits have to be able to be passed from generations to generations. And finally, there is no survival without a struggle, without overproduction. Overproduction means there are too many organisms for the resources available. Maybe if you're a plant, there's not enough sunlight, so you have to grow taller. You could be competing for food, air, water, space, nutrients in the soil, all sorts of good stuff. So these are the three things we need: variation, inheritance, and overproduction. That would be number 5 in your notes. So we're going to be moving on to number 6 then. So what is variation and what are the three sources? Well, variation is differences in the physical traits of the organisms, aka the phenotypes. The phenotypes, which are driven, of course, by the genotypes. So the sources of that variation are number one, random mutations. That is the ultimate source. We've seen random mutations can come about in several different ways. Mutagens causing these things. You had to study some of these for your genetic disease research project. Number two, genetic recombination during meiosis, crossing over. We just got done talking about that as well. That's another source of variation, is crossing over. And number 3 here is going to be migration or gene flow. We're going to get to that in just a moment. We'll talk about that in more detail. But our sources of variation for number 6, random mutation, genetic recombination, and migration, aka gene flow. All right, overproduction. So this is the survival part. That's the struggle part. There's a lot of offspring with very limited resources. We're competing for those resources. So this is overproduction of offspring. All these jellyfish in here, not enough food. Some of them are going to die because they're not getting enough food. You have to be good at getting food, and that's going to lead to your survival and your ability to reproduce. So, because remember, ultimately, all this is about which organisms get to reproduce and pass down their traits. You're not going to be able to reproduce if you can't find food. And finally, inheritance of adaptations. All right. Adaptation, any feature that allows an organism to better survive in its environment. So this picture is not here for no reason. So what adaptations do we see here? Well, it could be a few things. This is a spiky aloe plant. We have spikes here. That's it allows it to keep out predators. But it also has this inner area here, which I believe is a flower of some sort. That probably has a smell and a nectar that's going to attract insects in there and allow for pollination with other plants. So those are adaptations. These adaptations have to be genetic and inheritable. They have to be able to be passed down over time. And as these adaptations accumulate, as the strongest ones survive, you're going to change the gene pool. You're going to change the number of organisms in a population that have a certain trait. Okay? So, what this leads us to then is descent with modification. All right, so we're on to number 7 here in your notes. So, what we see over here on the side is we have a ancestral horse here 50 million years ago, a horse species. Over time, we see how its fossils have changed. Its coloration pattern has changed until we end up with a much larger tan horse with no stripes as compared to a very small black horse with a lot of stripes to begin with. So that is descent with modification. It was modified over time. So it's a chain in gene frequency over time. Beneficial traits are going to become more common, more common. And what does it mean to be beneficial? Again, beneficial just means that you're able to survive and reproduce. That's all it means to be beneficial. All right, so let's take a look at a real life example here. This is me in Hawaii about 4 years ago, just before COVID. Um, Walking through, this is a volcano here, an ancient volcano. Um, Walking through, looking at the rocks. I love looking at rocks as a geologist. And I look down and I see all these black lava rocks here. And then one day I went for a run. I was running along the shore, looking at the rocks, and I saw this. I saw two types of crabs here. So we see an orange crab and we see a black crab. And there were a lot more of these black crabs than there were orange crabs. In fact, it kind of looked like the rocks were moving. There were so many of these black crabs moving around in there. Um, which of these do you think would survive best? Yeah, obviously it's going to be the black crab, right? It's more camouflage. Predators can't find it as easily. Um, in fact, this was about the only living orange crab I saw. Every other orange crab I saw looked like this, just completely obliterated by whatever birds were able to find it and eat it. So over time, those orange crabs are going to die out and the black crabs are going to survive. So what do we think is going to happen to the color of the crabs over time? That's right. They're all going to become black. So that is the descent with modification there. And this is a really obvious example from Hawaii. Okay, so here's another example for you. There's two examples here in the text. I want you to figure out whether beetles on diet or beetles of a different color show descent with modification. Go ahead and put that in your answer. Okay, yep, that's right. Beetles of a different color is going to be the one. The reason for this is up here. Uh, it talks about a drought, and there's not enough plants for the beetles to eat, so all beetles die. It's not a this color or that color lives better, all of them die, or all of them get a little bit smaller. Whereas beetles of a different color says at first there's only 10% brown, and later on, 70% of them are brown. So that is a descent with modification there. Okay. Um, Now, why do these allele frequencies change? What are the mechanisms here? Let's take a look here. And so in your notes as well, you'll see some videos at like number 8, there's a video. And number 9, there's a video. We're gonna watch those in class and do those together. Again, that's part of this flipped classroom deal I'm trying to do here. We're gonna do notes online like this, and then we'll do these examples in person. Um, So we should be on to number 9 here, though. So the mechanisms of microevolution. Okay. Um, so for number 9, our 5 mechanisms are genetic drift, gene flow, non-random mating, aka sexual selection, mutation, and natural selection. So we have already talked about mutation and natural selection. We're going to go over these 3 specifically right now. All right, so the first one is genetic drift. Um, and this is number 10. It is random. All right. So this is one of those random things we talked about when we talked about natural selection, random change in frequency of alleles over time. So what might happen is rare alleles in a population will decrease in frequency. The other ones will increase. And then these are more apparent in small populations. So something like the crabs in Hawaii there, small population changes become apparent. But genetic drift is random, though. That's the thing to remember here. So looking at the bottom, you might see a scenario where you have a field of flowers, and in that field of flowers, you've got red and white roses. The red roses and this white roses might be the only ones that get to reproduce for one reason or the other. Maybe an arborist comes through and cuts down the rest of these roses and takes them in for flowers in a vase and leaves behind these other ones. Okay, so now we're left with these 3 reproducing, and then they reproduce, oh, something very similar, 3 white roses and a bunch of red roses. Now maybe the next season comes by, that arborist comes through, wipes out all these. Maybe he really likes the white ones for his vase, leaves behind some red ones. Well, now only red ones are reproducing, and you're going to end up with a population that's entirely red. So this is random change in the frequency of alleles over time. Okay, this is another way it might look too, is maybe you just have some beetles hanging out in the grass. This guy's running to work, doesn't see the beetles, steps on 2 of the green beetles. They're gone, they're dead, and what we end up with now is population with 6 brown and 1 green beetle. This is an entirely random event. Um, something else could be like a hurricane wiping out certain parts of a population of species. Um, natural disasters are definitely a driver of genetic drift. So some individuals just by chance leave behind a few more descendants, and over time the genes drift. Importantly, it does not produce adaptations, right? Because it's saying that neither being green nor brown in this case was an advantage. It was just completely random for how that happened. All right, our second one then is gene flow. Gene flow. Um, Gene flow is just described as migration. All right, so all that's happening here, sorry, it's the movement of genes into or out of a population. So we see that down here. We've got 1 brown beetle moving over into a population of entirely green beetles. Now there are brown alleles where there were none before, and they're mixing with the green alleles. This is like a lot of you talked about in your genetic disease research projects, where a disease originated perhaps in like Europe. We saw this with the blue people of Kentucky that in France methemoglobinemia originated there, and it was brought over by migration. Okay, it occurs during migration, and it results in an increase of genetic variability, the population into which that organism moved. This population is going to stay the same genetically, but this one changes over here. All right, so that is gene flow. And again, number 11 in your notes, we're going to watch that video in class. Number 12, you should have that as migration. Let's move on here to sexual selection or non-random mating. So we have a lot of really good videos here to watch. I like these videos. But essentially, sexual selection is saying that traits that aren't necessarily good for survival are passed down because without them you couldn't reproduce. So why do we have a peacock here? This dude, this is a male peacock. Actually, I should say it's just a peacock. The males are peacocks, the females are peahens. Um, the male here has this big, beautiful display of feathers. Well, that display of feathers does 2 things for him. One, it does help ward off predators. He can put that up and kind of scare away predators. But 2, he has to have this on in order to mate. A female will not mate with him if he does not have this big, beautiful display. Um, we're going to watch these other displays for birds where they have these features that just make no sense. In fact, might even inhibit their ability to evade predators, but without these features, the females won't accept them as mates. Um, So that is sexual selection or non-random mating. All right, so what happens? What are the outcomes of these things? So 14, the three outcomes in natural selection are going to be directional, disruptive, and stabilizing selection. Okay, so you can see those in your notes. So make sure to label them. And this picture is at the bottom of your notes there for 14. All right, so what we have here is we have an original population of mice. And what this shows is that there are 5 different colors of mice down here, right? And it says there's a few of these white mice, a few of these dark brown mice, but most of the mice are kind of light brown. In stabilizing selection, it would say that being lighter colored or darker colored is not favorable, and all of them kind of end up being here in the middle with this light brown color. Okay, so in directional selection, let me just erase this so we can get a little better view here of everything. All right, in directional selection, it might say that the light furred mice are not beneficial. So we're going to end up with only these darker ones. That population shifts over, and the most prevalent one is kind of the second darkest one. And then finally, in disruptive selection, it would say that the middle mouse color is not beneficial. Perhaps there's a dark environment and a light environment. So the light colored mice succeed and the dark colored mice succeed, but in the middle, that's not beneficial for either environment. So that is a disruptive selection. We're going to talk more about those as time goes on here. Okay, so we should be through number 14 in our notes. Let's move on to this thing called Hardy-Weinberg. Let's do some math. Love math. So what this is, it's genetic equilibrium. And equilibrium, remember, kind of means like staying equal. It means no changes. So it's no changes in the allele frequency of a population. It will say that evolution will not occur if the population is large, no migration occurs. There has to be random mating occurring here, so it can be no sexual selection either. No mutations going on, which that one's really hard to achieve because, as we know, organisms like to mutate. And then finally, no natural selection going on. So none of those drivers of natural selection we just talked about. No variation, inheritance, and overproduction. This is rare, very rare. The reason it shows penguins down there is because penguins have a large population. They're pretty isolated, so there's not much migration. There is random mating going on there. Now, the problem is there's probably going to be some mutations and some natural selection. But what we use this for is to just look at how close a population might be to genetic equilibrium. Okay. So what it says is that if a gene pool is stable and not evolving, then the frequency of alleles will not change. The equations can be used here when there are 2 alleles. This has to be simple genetics, okay? So what this allows us to do is to look at the phenotypic ratio of a population and calculate the genotype ratio, which is pretty cool. So we have 2 equations. First equation, you guys stick with me here. Things we need to know. P stands for the frequency of a dominant allele. Q stands for the frequency of a recessive allele. And that has to equal 1 or 100%. So for instance, P might be 70, Q might be 30%, sorry, 0.7, 0.3 equals 1. Okay. Now we have this other equation where it says P squared, so that's 2 dominant alleles, P times P, 2 dominant alleles, plus 2 times the heterozygous, right, where there's a dominant and a recessive allele, plus Q squared, that's 2 recessive alleles, equals 100%. So all that's saying is that the homozygous dominant plus the heterozygous individuals plus the homozygous recessive individuals make up 100% of the population. Okay. There is a practice problem in your notes there for number 16 on this. I am going to go over that in class with you, but if you want to give that a shot, go ahead and we'll see what we can do. This is that practice problem right here, but it's also in your notes that you should have from class. All right, guys, that's all I got for you here. We'll catch up on Tuesday